Hi, let's take a moment to talk about the concept of scope. Scope is the area in a program in which a variable exists and can be referenced. If I were to define a new term in this room, if I said a flim flam is just another word for a cell phone, everybody that hears me would know that. But somebody sitting in the other room wouldn't know that. That word would not be defined for them. It would not be in their scope. So when we define variables in different parts of the program, it may only exist in a portion of the program, and its scope doesn't extend to another part of the program. Similarly, when we try to change variables in one part of a program, we may have the ability to see it, but not the ability to affect it. So, for example, with that same definition, if I were in this room and I said a flim flam is a cell phone, and someone who heard that left the room, went somewhere else and told everybody flim flam used to mean cell phone, but now we're going to define it to mean guitar, that wouldn't change the original definition in this room. So every programming language treats scope and treats how variables are affected when they are passed as parameters to a method a little bit differently. So the best thing to do is experiment with them and play around with variables in any language that you're working with. So we're going to do that quickly in Python, JavaScript, and Java. So let's start with JavaScript. And what I have here is a function that's defined and a main program that's defined. And in both sections, I have really two variables. So down here in the main program, I have a variable x, which I just gave the value 7, and a variable y that has the value 3. And then we just do a lot of printing. So we try to print x and its value, y and its value. And I also have these other variables in x and in y, which we'll talk about in a second. Then on line 27, we assign a new value to y, which it gets from calling the scope function, and passes x and y as parameters. And then we just print everything again to see which values changed, if any. Now, this function is defined up here, scope function. And what we do is we take in parameters in x and in y. These are formal parameters, meaning it's like a form that is to be filled out later. In order for scope function to work, two variables need to be given in. In this case, we are giving it the variables x and y. So when we run the program, in x and in y are essentially just x and y. And in the scope function, we do essentially the same thing we did in the main program. We just print the values of in x, in y, x and y, make some changes to them. So in this case, we have x is equal to in x times 2, in y is equal to 10, and then we print these all again, and then finally return the value 0. So let's see what happens when we try to run this, if it runs at all or if we run into any errors. So I'm going to click run, and we get an error pretty much right away. So it said there's a reference error, in x is not defined. So that's taking place right here on line 24. You can see that note up here on line 24. But on line 24, we're trying to refer to in x, but in x is a temporary variable that only exists in the scope of this function. So I cannot call it down in this program below. So unfortunately, all of the lines that make reference to in x or in y down in this bottom program need to go. They simply don't exist down there. So let's try running it again and see if we run into any problems. All right, now it looks like it's working all right. If we look at the run of the program and compare variables as we go, we might see how it's behaving. So we start out with x and y equal to 7 and 3. We get to these two print statements, and we have the values 7 and 3 printed out. Then we go into the scope function, and first thing we print out in x and in y, which also have the value 7 and 3 because that's what we gave them. Interestingly, when we print x and y in JavaScript, they are in scope. So this function can see x and y and therefore can print them. They're 7 and 3. Then we make some changes. We make x is equal to in x times 2, in y equals 10. And we see in x did not change, but in y did. It changed to the value 10. And when we get down to x and y, x is now 14, y is 3. And we return the value 0, which gets written to y. And when we finally print x and y again, we still have 14, and now y equals 0. So this function was able to change the variables down here in the main program. So this function was in the scope of these variables. Now, let's take a look at two other languages, and it's the exact same code, just changed enough to work in that language. So next, let's look at Java. In Java, we have the same function, scope function. We have the same main program. We have X and Y defined again. So again, exact same program, and let's try running it. Now, in Java, we're going to see a lot of individual error messages, and it's always a good habit to start with the topmost error message first and work your way down. Sometimes the compiler just gets a little confused with your first error message. So it says, on line 6, cannot find the symbol X. So line 6 is inside the function, and it says it cannot find the symbol X. X is not in the scope of this function. X is defined down here. Now you'll notice Java, a little different than JavaScript, has this main section in its own code block. So this code block is not in the scope of this code block. All right, these are locally defined variables in the main method. Now I could comment these out, but another thing I could do is I could also make what's called globally defined variables. So I could actually take this X and take it out of the main and instead declare it at the class level. Now everything in the class is in the scope of X. Now I'm not going to do that just yet. We'll come back to that idea. For right now though, let's just comment out these print statements up here where we try to change X and Y. And we're also going to have to comment out this line that tries to assign a value to X because X cannot be referenced up here. Now let's try running again and see if we still get errors. And we most likely will. So now it's saying in X and in Y are not accessible. So just like in JavaScript, in X and in Y are temporary variables. Their scope does not extend down below. It's only defined in this function up here. So let's comment out these functions down here, or these print statements down here. And now we have a pretty bare bones program, but let's run it, see if we can get it to work. All right, so in our main program, we have X and Y. They're printed out 7 and 3. Then we go into the scope function where X and Y, or in X and in Y are 7 and 3. And oh, it looks like we are getting some kind of issue here where REPL just stopped working. So let's try running again just to see if it does a little better this time. That is interesting that it's just kind of crashing on us. So let's see if we can find out why. Maybe we actually have another bug that's just not running into or just not picking up. So we have 7 to 3 come in here, and then we get to this point where we're printing in X equals 7 again. And it seems to be working fine, so I'm not quite sure why it is dying here. But then when we return 0, we would expect to see print statements below. Now, let's take a quick moment to actually make that change I talked about before, where we take X equals 7, put it up at the class level, so it's now a global variable and everything is in the scope. Now, we should be able to print this out up here, and we should be able to change its value in here, and we should be able to see it down below. Now, here, we do have to make one little change. We have to make this a static type, and we're not going to get into that right now. But let's try running again and see what happens. All right, and it does still look like it is getting hung up on something. I'm not sure what that is, so we might have to look at that another time. But now in the scope function, I can reference it. It's allowing me to do that. And actually, I wonder if we just comment out a few of these other lines. Maybe there's just something going on the screen. But I want to see if we can get that X value just to print a few times, because I want to show that we can in fact change it once we put it inside scope. No, so it is just acting goofy. I'm not sure why, but we're just going to move on and take a look at Python. Okay, so now in our Python function, again, same idea. We have the exact same general method. We have the exact same function, but we're going to get error messages again. So we try to run it, we're going to crash. And its first thing is it says, I don't know what in X and in Y are. Oh, and I left all these semicolons in. It also doesn't like that. But it does not know what in X and in Y are because they are not in scope. They are defined in the function above, up here. They do not exist down here. So we need to get rid of them. And in Python, we can comment them out with a number sign or a hashtag. There's one. Get rid of those 2 lines, and we'll get rid of these 2 lines. All right, now let's try running it again. So we get to print these first 2 lines, then we get into the scope function, we print those 2 lines, but then we get an error here. So again, it's saying X is a local variable, is defined in enclosing scope on line 18, is referenced before assignment. So down here is where it is assigned, and it's saying you're trying to reference it before it actually has a value. So basically, it's getting confused because it's trying to reach this value, but because it's reading the program top to bottom, it thinks that it's not defined yet. So what happens in Python if we take this function definition and move it below the program? Well, now we're going to get similar problem, but with the function name. It's saying I don't know what scope function is because it's defined too low. So if we go back and put this back up top, the best approach here is just to say, well, I guess we can't use X because we're not really in the scope of this variable since it wasn't defined. We can take the approach we did in Java, which is define X up here globally, and that should help fix that there. Let's try running it and see. Let's see. Line 27 in the module. And let's see. Y equals this, file main line scope function print. Unbound local error, local variable X reference before assignment. So now that's saying on line 6, it's still referencing it before it's assigned. Now, what we thought would have solved it by putting in a global period actually isn't working, in part because it thinks it's really getting its assignment right here on line 8. So it's referring to this X, not that one. So that's not actually going to help. And like most other languages, we were starting to realize that your variables don't extend into the scope of a method definition. Methods tend to work pretty autonomously. They can use the parameters that are set up to be used when they're run. And if you have some globally defined variables, you can use those as well. I believe in Python, you actually have to write the word global to make a variable global, but I'd have to double check that. So let's comment out these X and Y methods here. All right. Now, notice this X variable is now giving us a different message. It's saying local variable X is assigned but never used. So even though this is technically a legal line of code, it is not changing the X value down here. It's just creating a new X value, which is going to be printed. So we can actually uncomment that line and print and see that that X should go through. So now that we run, we have X is 7 and 3. We go into the function, we get 7 and 3. In X does not change, so it stays at 7. In Y becomes 10. In the scope function, this X is 14, then we return 0. X remains unchanged at 7, and Y gets the value 0. So all 3 of these programs are essentially the same thing and just meant to show you that scope of a variable matters. And in every language, it's handled a little bit differently. So play around with whatever language you are using to figure out the scope of variables and how they're handled when you send them as parameters. All right, bye now.